الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. ألف لام ميم تلك آيات الكتاب الحكيم هدى ورحمة للمحسنين الذين يقيمون الصلاة ويؤتون الزكاة وهم بالآخرة هم يوقنون أولئك على هدى من ربهم وأولئك هم المفلحون ومن الناس من يشتري لهو الحديث ليضل عن سبيل الله بغير علم ويتخذها هزوا أولئك لهم عذاب مهين وإذا تتلى عليه آياتنا ولى مستكبرا كأن لم يسمعها كأن في أذنيه وقرا فبشره بعذاب أليم. إن الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات لهم جنات النعيم خالدين فيها وعد الله حقا وهو العزيز الحكيم خلق السماوات بغير عمد ترونها وألقى في الأرض رواسي أن تميد بكم وبث فيها من كل دابة.
Assalamu alaikum wa barakatuhu. Taribun fi madrasi Apocatastasis. Hello, everyone. I'm John Coleman from that illustrious madrasa ApocatastasisInstitute. And the purpose of this broadcast is to have some opening remarks on the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun. And from the jump, I want it to be known that I do not approve of the color scheme or even the design of the banners. Occasionally on StreamYard, which is the platform I'm using, if you can't tell, with the duck in the upper right, occasionally on StreamYard, they will shuffle things up. I don't know what goes on with coding. It's Greek to me, but we'll enjoy the blue tinting and the more edgy banner, though I prefer the green and the rounded. But here we are, alhamdulillah, here we are, and we're looking at the Muqaddimah. But are you seeing me? No, you're not. Probably just as good. You can hear me, but you can't see me. Not that you needed to. All right, here I am, and here's where we need to be. Yes, so we're looking at the Muqaddimah. This is part of our cycles class here at Apocatastasis. And so this is a 10-week course, and always as good students, whether you are joining us live or after the fact, as good students, we always want to reorient ourselves. Schools, as we know them, in terms of a vast field, will not be around for very much longer. Schools will always be around, just like home brewing will always be around, just like there will always be somebody to make barrels the old-fashioned way or wagons. Schools are not going away, but schooling as we understand mass education is not long for this world, largely because, very appropriate to Ibn Khaldun today, society changes and its allegiances and its loves and hates change. And the world that birthed mass education no longer exists. We want to orient ourselves, and that's what schools can do well. So what are we doing in this class? This is the cycles class. We're looking at this phenomena of rhythms in time from different cultures. How have the scholars of different societies interpreted the rhythms of human life on this earth? It seems very natural, doesn't it? Nature has its cycles. Here we are as of our class time today in November. I might reference it because this is a history class. It is the 11th of November, which is Veterans Day here in America, a minor holiday. It is more significant in Europe. This is the anniversary of the end of the First World War. So a very historical day for other reasons we might get into as well. But in any case, society goes through cycles. Here we are in November, it's autumn, the wind is blowing outside. Our bodies in various capacities go through cycles. The stars go through cycles, and so forth. And that the animal kingdom goes through cycles, and so forth, and so forth. So does human life on this earth. And so orienting ourselves, we have begun our journey looking at what is time, what is memory, what is history. We moved last week into a concrete analysis. Actually, this is the number 4, number 3, number 4, whatever the case may be. We did look at Abrahamism, which we'll revisit today with Ibn Khaldun and St. Augustine. Last week we looked at and his City of God, which is really the first true historiographical text. Now, that is not to say before St. Augustine in the late 4th, 5th century that you don't have people writing about history. You do, of course you do. You have Herodotus, you have other fellows, you have Pliny the Elder, and certainly other people mentioned history in passing. But what makes St. Augustine different is he tries to fit everything into a synthetic, or shall we say a symphonic, either word is appropriate, vision, a unified vision, lowercase c, Catholic vision, or lowercase kappa if you speak Greek, Catholicos, a universal vision. That's what makes St. Augustine's City of God outstanding, or one of the number of things that makes that document outstanding. Today, we're moving on. We don't leave Augustine behind. We don't leave the perennialists behind. We build. Right, we're building in this class, and now we're looking at another fellow, Ibn Khaldun, from what he calls in his Muqaddimah, the Maghreb. The Maghreb is North Africa, particularly Northwest Africa. So we'll look at him today and his vision of history, and in a sense, a step farther than St. Augustine, and a man obviously coming from a different culture in various ways, who has different ways of chopping up history. So by way of orientation, continuing here, we remember that prior to the Abrahamic religions coming along, and outside of those cultures, those religions being Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, those are the Abrahamic religions. We'll look at what historiographically makes them unique. But outside of those systems, in a giant umbrella, which might be called perennialism or paganism, as you like, their natural theology even, there was generally an emphasis on the cyclical nature of history, obviously influenced by the very cycles already mentioned. Abrahamic religions are different in the sense that their deity acts in time. And that's going to be very important to understand the Muqaddimah. Allah, as the Muslims will call God, Allah will act in concrete ways in the Old and New Testaments and in the life of Muhammad. So this is unique about Abrahamism, is that the God that's worshipped is acting through events. My first interaction with Ibn Khaldun in college was through this text, which is a very approachable text. People might want to look it up. I'm sure, courtesy of Vladimir Putin and the Yandex fellows, I'm sure oceans of PDF will be able to supply your needs if you want to read Ben Saddam Himich's Polymath. This is a fictionalized biography of a part of Ibn Khaldun's life, particularly when he was a Hadi, or an Islamic judge, in Egypt for a stretch there. And if memory serves, it also covers the time when he speaks to Tamerlane, the barbarian, and a man responsible for a huge sea change in Islamic culture, which you could argue still affects the world to this day. We can approach that later when we look at Ibn Khaldun's meeting with Tamerlane, or sometimes just called Timar. For the sake of time, I didn't have it queued up, but some of you may be interested in reading Edgar Allan Poe's poem on Tamerlane. It's a lengthier poem, but one that's worth reading. But in this book, The Polymath, you get a lot of background, as I'll attempt to cover briefly here, with Ibn Khaldun, this outstanding figure during what's called in the Christian West the 14th century. So this is at the time in Europe when a lot of Islamic cultural work, frankly, is making its way up there, let's say, up as Ibn Khaldun calls it in the Muqaddim, the Christian North, speaking of Europe. And in particular, Aristotle. And obviously Europeans knew about Aristotle, but they didn't know, they kind of thought of him more as a biologist up until about the 14th century. And then all of a sudden, people learn a lot more about Aristotle, and it has a lot of shall we say, knock-on effects in Christian history, not the least of which was scholasticism, which sets off a whole chain of intellectual developments which lead not just to the scholastic movement, but to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment in various ways. So it's quite an introduction. And we can see a very, well, I shouldn't say very, but we can see a more Hellenistic type of Islam with Ibn Khaldun. I mentioned this in our earlier classes, that Abrahamism has a love-hate relationship with Hellenism. And it has to do with the whole concept of revelation. And if you can learn truths naturally, does that somehow negate, or maybe more accurately, does that somehow downgrade the claims of revelation? Could you theoretically just learn the truth of the universe naturally through observation and discourse, which is ultimately what the Enlightenment in the 18th century in Europe will posit? You can see if one is a believer in prophets and angels and books and things like this that the Abrahamists hold to, you can see why this might make one a little bit squeamish. Christianity less so, at least Mediterranean types of Christianity, Orthodoxy and Catholicism, less hostile to Hellenism. Rabbinic Judaism, Islam, a little bit more, sometimes much more. Sometimes Christians will have a big blowback against Hellenism. Sometimes that's called the Reformation in the West. So it is a kind of a love-hate relationship. But Ibn Khaldun represents that type of Islam. And frankly, I hinted at this just a few minutes ago, frankly, a type of Islam which stops being mainstream after Tamerlane. So briefly, and we will nibble at this article now. Briefly, you have this invasion from Russia down into the Middle East, using modern designations, and led by Tamerlane or Timur. This I think grandson of one of the barbarians, I forget, from the Orient, I might say so here, but in any case, a man on a mission, and not a pacific mission. And so this invasion of the barbarians, and I hesitate to say what tribe. I think it was the Huns, but Mongols. The Mongols. Okay, there we go. Of the Mongols come down, and this disrupts Islamic society, as some people argue, and I'm reciting to you, even down to today. So you have this very cosmopolitan, rather Hellenized, rather sophisticated Islam, which, though it comes from the desert and is rough and ready early on, eventually does come into contact with Byzantine culture and with earlier North African Roman cultures and the Persians, who are much more settled and erudite peoples. And, the froth of early Islam does simmer down and learns how to, like the Christians and to a certain extent the Jews did before them, learn how to assimilate Hellenism. And then you have the Mongols, and then what happens is the ulama, of which Ibn Khaldun is part of, the ulama, meaning the scholars of Islam. So in Islam, it's like Rabbinic Judaism, and like Protestant Christianity, the scholars basically fill the role of priests. So they will often lead the prayers, and they will have that authority. Like the Catholics and the Orthodox, they'll have priests, and they'll look to Russia or Constantinople or the Vatican for their religious guidance. Well, if you're a Muslim, who do you look to? You look to your scholars. You look to your ulama. And indeed, the great Islamic school is where Ibn Khaldun was for a while associated with, and that's Al-Azhar, which is, again, like the Muslim Vatican in Cairo. Is it a religious institution like the Vatican, or like the Russian Orthodox or the Greek Orthodox churches? No, but it serves that role, at least for Sunni Islam. And then the Mongols come, like I say, and they kill a great deal of the ulama in their invasion throughout the Islamic world. The Mongols come down, and they slaughter, and there are piles of skulls and all sorts of gore. And what ends up happening this is after Ibn Khaldun, but what ends up happening to Islam, which gives us some of our stereotypes about the religion, somewhat deserved since then, is that you have second and third tier scholars. This is one of the interpretations of the legacy of the Mongols. You have second and third tier scholars having to fill the role that the first tier scholars did, but now the first tier scholars, the guys actually in the mosques and in the madrasas and things, they're all dead because of the Mongols. And so the generations after are less qualified and much clunkier, and that explains arguably the less nuanced type of Islam which has predominated since then, which is a very similar phenomena you actually see at about the same time in the Christian West with the Black Death. That's one of the explanations, trying to make connections here, that's one of the explanations of the Black Death, or rather the consequences of the Black Death, and ultimately of the corruption of the church in the West leading to the Reformation, is how did you get this kind of bloated, sloppy, corrupt late medieval church? Well, the argument is that the top tier priests and scholars in the Christian West all died off, and you had this huge baby boom afterwards, and all those people needed to go to mass on Sunday and have baptisms and things, and so you just had much like the Islamic world, less qualified people filling clerical roles, and that leads to a degraded religious atmosphere. So very interesting, this 14th century, regardless of religion, a similar phenomena. Now, being a Muslim, I should say, by the way, I did not actually plan it this way whatsoever at all. But this semester, our open events are paralleling some of our courses here very nicely. I swear on a stack of Qurans that I'm not making this up. But this evening at 4:30 Pacific time, 7:30 Eastern, we have a seminar on the Quran, arguing along with other texts this semester, arguing that the Quran and Islam mark the beginning of the medieval time. So this is our medieval beginning series. We looked at the city of God and then the consolation of philosophy the past couple of weeks. Now we're looking at the Quran. Next week we'll look at the Song of Roll. Read the Quran, or had it read to me, courtesy of a screen reader. If you can see this little bugle where my cursor is, this is an app called Read Aloud, and I swear by the sun and the moon and all the gods and Tir and Og that this thing is a lifesaver. You can get through so much with that. It's a different activity than reading proper. I'm going to acknowledge that, but the Read Aloud app, those of you who have to get through a lot of text, this is your best friend, the Read Aloud app. Courtesy of the Read Aloud app, which was not nearly as pretty as that fella at the beginning of our class that was singing one of the chapters of the Quran. The Read Aloud app did read to me the Quran, and I was reminded of one of the foundational aspects of Islam, which is very different than Christianity and Judaism, is the concept of restorationism, especially compared to Christianity, where you have, for a Muslim, you have this idea that God has sent prophets from the time of Adam to every single group of people on the earth. And every single group of people either killed the prophets or distorted their legacy, and whatever the case may be, God just kept sending prophets, and the messages kept getting corrupted. And then finally, God just has to put his foot down and send an incorruptible message. And that's what Muslims believe is Islam. And that's a very interesting concept. You can consider Islam, this maybe the most restorationist of religions. This idea that you have a revelation, it gets corrupted, and it has to be restored. Similar in the West to the part of the thesis of the Reformation, at least ecclesiologically, was this concept as regards the church. You have this original, pristine, primitive church that eventually gets to be bloated and so forth, and needs to be restored to its original simplicity. Interestingly, in the Christian West, and there's a lot of ways where classical Islam is very modern. Interestingly, that's in a secularized way, that's pretty much the thesis of the Enlightenment in the West for the past 300 or 400 years. Is that not the thesis? Not that there's a revelation that God sent down that keeps getting corrupted, but that there is an original purity, a state of nature that we have lost, and somehow, maybe through a revolution or through education or through voting in enlightened policies, somehow we will reclaim this original pristine condition that we all have left. It's fascinating, this idea, how it pops up in different cultures. But getting back to Ibn Khaldun and the Islamic milieu, you really can't go very far without a historical consciousness. So we're going to get to his specifics in the Muqaddimah, and we're going to get into what the Muqaddimah is and was intended to be, which are two slightly different things. Something else, again, looking just in the broad Islamic milieu, not just do you have this restorationist idea about history, but also very pre-modern. Again, this is what struck me about the Quran, somewhat similar to the Christian liturgy, but way more so in the Quran, is almost this idea, if you forgive me, of hyperlinks in the Quran, meaning the Quran is not chronologically ordered. The Quran is organized as a book in a very similar way to the Christian epistles in the New Testament and the prophets in the Old Testament, which is longest to shortest. I must have missed that in Sunday school, by the way. It wasn't until my early 30s that I realized that, all those documents, respectively, were happening at basically the same time. I was just kind of assumed it was all chronological, but I shouldn't say all, but a good lot of the Old Testament prophets, those guys are living at the exact same time. And it blew my mind when I realized that it was organized longest to shortest. Likewise, the Quran. But what's interesting about the Quran, because it's not just are the chapters not organized in any chronological sense, they're organized by size, but also the ayat, or the verses, are not in any real sense chronological, but they were just compiled in this fashion. Now, if you're a Muslim, you're going to see a certain reality or a certain purpose to that. But it did remind me, I said parts of Islam are very postmodern, and it did remind me of the hyperlink that I'm just kind of teasing here on the screen. You're jumping around. That would, going through the Quran, that struck me. You're jumping around between Moses and Adam and Jesus, and this property dispute in Mecca in the 7th century, and now you're back to this invasion, and now it's this time in Muhammad's life. Now you're looking at Moses and Aaron, and there's a lot of meta. The Quran is a very meta book in various ways, including how it plays with history in a non-chronological, postmodern fashion. So that struck me. And then just a final general thing, and this is very appropriate to Ibn Khaldun, and that is the fact that he's a Hadi. Ibn Khaldun, as one of our introductions pointed out, was a judge. He was only secondarily a historian, an amateur historian, which doesn't mean he was sloppy. The word amateur doesn't mean sloppy. It means from amor, right? If you're doing something as an amateur, it means you're doing it for love, right? Amor, right? Amateur. So he's doing it for love. And but his day job is as a Hadi, and something that struck me from the Quran is also the Islamic focus on the community. Just because of the nature of Islam and the fact that Muhammad was a civil leader like Moses, there's a much more pronounced civic consciousness to Islam in a way that certainly the Christians lose over the centuries. And going through the Quran lately, that's what struck me, is the use of the word piety in its proper context, which I happen to be writing a very extensive essay on, unrelated to this course right now. And piety, even going to the so-called pagan world, piety always has a communal aspect to it. Piety does not mean going to your Wednesday Bible church or going to your rosary meeting and saying your prayers and my prayers before bed. Piety, understood in many, many traditions up until quite recently, piety always had a social consciousness. It's almost interchangeable with the word patriotism, or good citizenship, and that's the way it's used in the Quran. And you better bet your bippy that Ibn Khaldun has that focus in the Muqaddimah. Now, this text is easy to obtain online, and you can download it I think I have a copy, in fact, on our docs site. Strangely enough, I did not put the weekly class document on this, which I will correct. I will also update last week's St. Augustine presentation here. This is our main site. What am I doing? But next week, I should say, we're going back west, and we're going to look at Giambattista Vico. And during our private class, after this set of introductory remarks, we will look at Vico as well, setting up for next week in particular. But the Muqaddimah, what is the Muqaddimah? The word literally means introduction. And this was intended, and it was, the opening treatise on a much larger history of the world that Ibn Khaldun was writing, looking in particular at the Berbers and the Arabs, as well as the Persians and the Byzantines. And he'll develop those themes within the Muqaddimah, which in even the lifetime of Ibn Khaldun began to kind of spin off into its own focus. So interesting there. So this basically section of introduction becomes its own book, and a lengthy book it is, at a little bit shy of 700 pages in this document. And in this regard, we see Ibn Khaldun is similar to St. Augustine. He's trying to put all of history into a unified whole. But he's going a step farther because he's stepping out of the religious realm in what we would call a term he would have no idea what to make of this. And this is what we call an anachronism. I'm going to use a term, and I'm going to use it anachronistically, which is to say I'm going to use a concept which would have been absolutely impossible for Ibn Khaldun or St. Augustine to imagine. And that is to say that Ibn Khaldun steps, S-T-E-P-S, steps into the secular. The idea of a non-spiritual reality is impossible, even with all your Aristotle. Aristotle is about as close as you come to that, which is why he causes some discomfort in certain Abrahamic circles. But nevertheless, even Aristotle is not secular in the modern concept. But that is what differentiates Ibn Khaldun from St. Augustine, is he questions religious sources respectfully. I mean, he goes to his grave as a practicing Sunni Muslim, right? He's respectfully critical in his early sections of the Muqaddimah about certain stories in the Bible. Now, that's interesting because from the Islamic point of view, the Bible, or the Torah and the Injil, as the Muslims would call it, is somewhat corrupted, and yet it still has this divine seal. But he uses the example of Moses leading 600,000 people out of Egypt, and he says this is impossible on the grounds that you could never feed such an army, and you could never, more to the point, you could never control such an army on the battlefield. It would be from one part of the horizon to the next, and how could you move your flanks and so forth like that? So he takes a more rationalistic, let's say that. If he's not secular, can we say he's more rationalistic, or respectfully critical and respectfully skeptical of certain claims of authority? And he'll get into, in the Muqaddimah, why different communities corrupt history, and he has seven reasons why this is. And in part 2 of this, the private part and the chit chat, we will get into that. We will get into the specifics there. But the one, and this is number 7, we'll give you a freebie here, but this is the the real take home, and this is really what sets off the rest of the meditation in the Mukaddima. Number 7, which is the final one, is why does history change? Why do empires come and go? Number 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, because men do not know the nature of history. They do not know the cycles. They do not know the rhythms of history. And because of that, uh, partially, this is the biggest, not the only, this is the biggest reason that civilizations fall, and conversely, why they rise. People are not aware of the energies that are at work. Now, for Ibn Khaldun, his key is not St. Augustine's key. When we had our class last week, we looked at St. Augustine, and we saw that this other North African scholar, interesting that both Ibn Khaldun and St. Augustine are North Africans. This is a statue of Ibn Khaldun in, I think, Egypt. But St. Augustine says that history moves because of providence, and empires rise and fall, like Rome, as he's experiencing quite literally with the Vandals, because of the virtues and the vices, right? Things rise and fall because of the virtues and the vices of the people, and everything follows a divine plan. For Ibn Khaldun, that's not quite the key to what's at play. For him, as we have entitled this class, for him it's Asabiyya. Asabiyya, like many Arabic words, it's fun to say, Asabiyya. And this is social solidarity. This is what explains the rise of a people. I mean, especially look now. We want to put this in context. Ibn Khaldun is living 500 years after the advent of his religion and his culture, because Islam explodes. Talking about acting in history, Islam explodes onto the scene. These scrappy Bedouins, after doing fuck all, as the British say, for their entire history, expending all their energy to speak about kind of an enlightenment idea of why civilizations go places and others don't. One of the really interesting, we'll look at this, interesting enlightenment ideas is that oppressively hot, environmental interpretation of history. Oppressively hot climates don't produce things, don't produce civilizations, because the people are, and oppressively cold ones as well, because the people are just trying to survive at subsistence level, and all their energy is spent on trying to cool down. And this seems to be the case with the Arabs until they came across something like Islam and the Quran, which got them going, quite literally. And all of a sudden, these tribal barbarians are encountering and defeating very well-established Persian and Roman armies, what we would call Byzantine armies, sweeping across North Africa, hitting the Visigoths in Spain. In just 100 years, So, this too is not just the religious claims of Islam, but it is the results of that, I suppose, of Islam. Once it hits people, it gets them going and creates a historical phenomena, a very concrete historical phenomena of conquest. You can bet that weighs on his mind. And then degeneracy, right? And so, even in his own community, let's say, Ibn Khaldun is looking at that. He comes from a very old family, from if it wasn't the Hijaz, which is that area of Arabia between Mecca and Medina, which is a very special area. If you're a Muslim, it's, basically like Jerusalem for Christians and Jews. It's like the download spot of your religion. If he didn't come from there, he came from Yemen, or his family rather came from Yemen, and they were part of the nobility that became the caliphate. And So you have the historical consciousness of Islamic revelation. You have the historical reality that plays on Ibn Khaldun's mind of the initial glory of Islam in terms of martial prowess and conquest. And if you're a Muslim, there probably is some very close connection between the truth of your religion and the fantastic success of your armies. And then, as Ibn Khaldun knows, because his family, after coming from, we'll say the Arabian Peninsula somewhere, finds itself helping and being part of the nobility in Spain at about the time the caliphate in Spain collapses. And then that explains why Ibn Khaldun finds himself wearing Spanish clerical juristic robes, heavier robes, as one of our introductions pointed out, heavier robes than was the case in Egypt. He kept that, just like Saint Justin Martyr kept his pagan Greek philosopher robes even when he became a Christian. Likewise, even after he leaves Spain, Ibn Khaldun continues to wear the robes of Spanish Islam, which apparently were heavier given the climate. Or, not to get too off the mark, how George Washington shows up at the First Continental Congress wearing his British Army uniform, hinting that, I have military background, guys, you should hire me. It occurs to me, again, not to get too off the mark here, but it occurs to me today is the anniversary of the end of the First World War. And that event of the Great War has a lot of ramifications in Islamic society down until today, especially the complete end of the caliphate for the past 100 years. So that's, that itself marks an interesting chapter in Islamic history. But anyway, getting back to the Muqaddimah and getting back to Ibn Khaldun's theses, he has the idea of Asabiyya. So this is like group solidarity. So what explains, to use the Islamic example, what explains the success of that group from a part of the peninsula, conquers the peninsula, and then within, I think it's like maybe 5 or 6 or 7 years, is going head to head with Byzantine armies, Roman armies, at Yarmouk and these other places, and defeating them, and encountering the Persians and defeating them. Ibn Khaldun is going to say that's social solidarity. And what conversely, fast forward the tape, what explains in his life the maybe decrepit is too strong a word, but the weak nature of Islamic societies, weak enough that it's collapsing in Spain, stalling out in what we call Turkey today, about to be completely gutted with an invasion from the Mongols, unbeknownst to our man here. What explains this decrepitude is the lack of social solidarity, and partially that's going, what explains it unraveling? Well, partially that's going to be luxury. And there's a certain point in the Muqaddimah that he talks about, the original Arabs went out, the Islamic Arabs went out to war, and the most luxurious of them, the most given to luxury, would maybe have a few pieces on their horse's bridle that were covered with silver. And fast forward to later times, and then whole accoutrements of Islamic guys in gold going out to fight. And he said, and he sees this connection, which is something we see going back even to the ancient world. Cato the Elder pointed out that seesaw between how would you say, Spartan living conditions and spiritual greatness, worldly greatness as well, and then luxury and decline. Very interesting. And pagan, Christian, or Jew, if you're given to moral philosophy, you'll probably see a similar seesaw correlation when it comes to individuals. And do we not know that perhaps in our own lives, and certainly in observation? I can think of people when they were poor, they were cool. I can think of families like this when they didn't have a pot to piss in, they were cool to hang out with. And life happens and wealth happens and people aren't so cool after a while. So these are actually very appropriate to last week's discussion with St. Augustine. As above, so below, so to speak, or microcosm, macrocosm. We see these same principles in the life of a man, the life of a family, the life of a city, the life of a people, the life of a faith. There's a connection there. Oh, wow. Cycles. This whole class is on cycles. Wow. So like nature of cycles, history. Wow. It's almost all connected. Maybe they're onto something. Okay. So our last section here before we take a little bit of a break is courtesy of ChatGPT. And I have to say, I played around with this stuff before, but this was, somewhat startling. So I typed in this prompt, compare St. Augustine's and Ibn Khaldun's historiography. This was my prompt for here. And holy guacamole, it came up with a pretty damn good outline. And nothing wrong with that, but I'm sure I'm not the only one to notice this, the ability for this thing to be used badly or to be overused, I shudder to think where this is going to go. This is great. This is, very helpful. But nevertheless, the overconfidence this chat AI stuff is going to inaugurate is something that's very sobering. But we're going to have some fun here. There are some benefits to this, and we're gonna use that. So, St. Augustine and Ibn Khaldun are two towering figures in the history. I should also say before I go on here, if you'll bear with me, it's been reported that these chat things will flatter you, because the Silicon Valley people, they know that this will keep your attention on their website if the machine flatters you. And actually, I did this on another computer. I asked the exact same prompt, and the computer actually started flattering me about what a great query and what a rare question it was, and wasn't I insightful for asking it. So beware of luxury, let's say that, even when machines are whispering to you. Okay, so these two guys are two towering figures in the history of historiography. So just to be clear, historiography is the analysis of history writing. Both Ibn Khaldun and St. Augustine, for example, look at the Roman Empire at different times, right? Even different names, right? Byzantine or Rome, whatever. But they're both looking at the same subject. But their analysis of their subject is different, and it's exploring the difference of analysis, which we call historiography. Each of these fellows developed distinctive ways of thinking about history, time, and the role of human beings in shaping the past. Despite their differing cultural contexts, St. Augustine maybe in late antiquity or early medieval, and Ibn Khaldun in certainly a medieval Islamic world, both made lasting contributions to the theory and practice of writing history. So for St. Augustine, history is linear. I'm going to have an exception with both of these here. I'm going to actually suggest something different. But for Augustine, the machine tells us history is linear and unfolds according to the divine plan. In his 5th century City of God, he contrasts the city of God with that of man, divine and temporal concerns. History for Augustine is a progression towards an ultimate end and the fulfillment of God's will, culminating in the establishment of the kingdom of God. There is a beginning, a middle, and an end to human history, which is directed by God's providence. Ibn Khaldun acknowledges that history involves cycles. He doesn't treat history as a purely repetitive cycle, like some pre-Islamic thinkers. In his Muqaddimah, he introduces the concept, nearly 1,000 years after Augustine, of Asabiyya, social cohesion or group solidarity, as the force that drives the rise and fall of civilizations. Through his cyclical view of the rise and decline of dynasties, though it is somewhat cyclical in nature, he is more focused on the sociology of history and less on divine providence. Ibn Khaldun sees history as a process of the development and decay of human societies based on social, economic, and political forces. Augustine's history is a progression towards a divine teleological end, the parousia, as the Christians call it, the second coming, the visitation, and that has an official context to it, the visitation. When your boss shows up at work, that's a parousia. That's the Christian second coming. While Ibn Khaldun's history is driven by social and material forces, following a cyclical pattern of the rise and fall, but not necessarily culminating in a divine purpose. I would just add, I would take some reservations with this, which is why we don't over rely on these machines. These things are good to get thoughts going, and sometimes you'll find that they bring things to mind. I've tried to use this stuff to write poetry, and they'll bring words to mind that you wouldn't think of. But also there are limits. So I would actually argue there, being both Abrahamists, Augustine and Ibn Khaldun, having their differences, yes, are both very similar. I would say they both see history both as linear and cyclical, almost. I don't have it here. I used to have springs, little springs, but you know what a spring looks like? Here. Courtesy of the little boy who helped me clean up the yard the other day. This is a screw. This will do our trick here in terms of a shape. I would say that the historiography, let me blow up the screen here. The historiography of both men, though they have different foci as to what's moving history forward, whenever I take over the screen, come on. Here we go. So it has threads, right? And the way this thing gets into a piece of wood is by moving down the threads and anchoring the threads in the material. So I would say both men have a linear view of history that still at the same time goes in cycles, like a spring or a nail or whatever. Right? I would say this is probably a better shape, if you like, to understand their historiography, because both of them believe in an eschaton, right? In a end world scenario. So there's an end there and a beginning, of course. And except for some Gnostical tendencies in both religions, not both men, that's pretty much the orthodox conception in both religions. So I would push back against the summary there just a little bit. So the role of divine providence. Augustine's approach to history is deeply theological. God's providence governs all events in human history. That's why Augustine spends so much time in the first half of the Civitas Dei on the history of Rome. Because, and this was very, very characteristic of the Christianity of Augustine's day, it did not see Rome as an enemy force or as an evil force. It saw Rome equally as being chosen by God, as the Hebrews were, in a different way. He believes that human suffering, the rise and fall of nations, and even the failures of political systems are all part of God's plan. History for Augustine is the manifestation of the divine will. For Ibn Khaldun, the role of religion in history is acknowledged, he does not place divine providence at the center of his historiography, which is very interesting, especially because of the Islamic belief in kismet, what's sometimes translated as fate, or maybe, to steal the Calvinist phrase, double predestination. He emphasizes Asabiyya as the natural and sociological causes behind the rise and fall of civilizations. His focus is more on human agency, political organization, and economic factors than on divine intervention. Key differences: Augustine sees history as a divine plan in which God's will shapes the course of events, while Ibn Khaldun stresses human-driven social dynamics and does not rely on divine providence to explain historical change. And we can keep the rest for a little bit later. Interestingly, I found it so that Arnold Toynbee, whom we're going to be looking at, and his study of history in the 20th century, Arnold Toynbee makes a lot of use of Ibn Khaldun and this whole idea of Asabiyya, and we'll see how that influences. So we ought to be seeing these stepping stones of different historians, how one concept influences another and is developed upon. I'll see if I can dig up during the break coming up the statement of Toynbee's, but preparing for class today, that's something that struck me, being familiar with the study of history and that whole take. And actually, obviously, because Toynbee spoke about Ibn Khaldun explicitly, that's interesting to me, because Toynbee was hired by what we call the CFR nowadays, the Council on Foreign Relations, which puts out the magazine of the same name, Foreign Relations, which is worth reading if you want to know what the globalists are up to in general. You can get it at your local library every 2 months. I read them religiously to know what the old devils are up to. But the idea of Toynbee's is that, because he was hired by the CFR to explore, was it theoretically possible to have a civilization which doesn't fall, like a globalist New World Order civilization? And that caused Toynbee to go off on this 20-year writing journey to explore this. And one of the reasons in his study of history, this Toynbee, but I think it's very much influenced by Ibn Khaldun, who Toynbee evidently was very aware of, because he had a lot of kind words to say about the man, and I'll try to dig up that quote. One of the reasons that history changes is because of what Toynbee calls the internal proletariat becomes disgruntled. And I'm trying to plug that into Asabiyya. So what creates a civilization in the beginning and gets it that power? It's social cohesion. That's Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun influences Toynbee in the 20th century. Toynbee observes that often a civilization will produce an internal group of people that are dissatisfied with the situation. This will be the internal proletariat, as he calls them. And he uses the example of the Christians in Rome, that you had all of these beggars and all of these slaves and all of these women that did not feel part of and were not partaking of the Asabiyya. They were not taking part in this social cohesion. So what happens is, like a cancer in a society, another group begins to develop within the society. And eventually, this is one of about 20 different ways that Toynbee will develop as to why civilizations rise and fall. He really thought about this. We're taking a 10-week class on this. Toynbee spent 20 years thinking and writing about this. But it's interesting, Toynbee was hired by globalists. It would appear, just put this in your cap for when we get to Toynbee, it would appear the globalists have tried to almost jujitsu this idea of Asabiyya. So for Ibn Khaldun, social cohesion And feeling part of the group and the values of the group is what gives civilizations and peoples and tribes and religions strength. And in a very bastardized, pirated way, you can argue the so-called globalists in the West, they're aware of this, but their response to it is not to build up the people in greatness, but to suck out all sense of social cohesion and belonging. And so you end up with atomized consumers, people who are completely without agency, because they do not feel part of the society. As I've said in other contexts, we are just now all living around each other. We're moving around each other, but we have no society. That's not a mistake. It's not for nothing these people send their children to Yale and Harvard to study history at 2 and 3 and 4 times the rates that you get at public and mainstream private schools. They're very well aware of this. But unlike Ibn Khaldun and unlike St. Augustine, they're much more Machiavellian in how they come and how they use this knowledge and how they use it against people. So anyway, we have some thoughts here, and we're going to knock off the recording and take a brief break. Finally, I do invite everyone to take a look at ApocatastasisInstitute's site. We have all sorts of things, including the cycles class, which you can enroll in, and all sorts of other history classes you can find during the break and during your look at our School of Arts. That's what you're after here, if you want to see our other history courses. Okay, well, with that, for the live student, just hang on a hot second and we'll stretch our legs. And then for the rest of you, thanks for watching. And how do the Muslims say goodbye? Masalama. That's it. Masalama.